Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Battle Gamer, and today we're doing another archetype from Pathfinder 2e. I am getting back on the list here, and I'm very excited for this one, and hopefully it does a little bit better than the Eldritch Researcher. I'm very sad that video did poorly. I love the Eldritch Researcher, but I guess you guys are just not interested in the nerdier archetypes. But hey, that's fine. Today we're going to be slinging elements and improving our spellcasters. Oh god, is this another nerdy one? Oh, well, this is really cool. And anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Elementalist. The Elementalist is a class archetype, and in fact, is going to be the first class archetype that we've talked about here in the series. The Elementalist itself, well, okay, so a class archetype, let me talk about that first. A class archetype is a archetype that affects how your class works, and it operates in a slightly different way. First of all, when you select a class archetype, well, one, you need your GM's permission, of course, and you actually select it at level 1 when you make your character. By doing so, it does affect some of your class features or some of your abilities, and you must always select the archetype dedication at level 2 no matter what. If you're using the bonus archetype feat, obviously you can use that slot for the archetype, but it doesn't matter in any regard. You must select the class archetype at level 2, which means that if you want to select any other archetypes in your build, you have to wait until at least level 6. No, after level 6, yeah. Because you need to select at least 3 feats from the archetype in general. So that's something to keep in mind when you're selecting the archetype. But the Elementalist is a really good one. So if we look here, in order to become an Elementalist, you must be a spellcasting, or you must have a spellcasting class feature that chooses from the arcane or primal spell list. This is very important because under here, the elemental adjustments, you replace your spell list with the elemental spell list. Now, this spell list is somewhat more reduced, but it does select spells from multiple traditions. It has a lot more elemental-based spells. Now, if you're playing a sorcerer with the elemental bloodline, you can replace your initial bloodline spell with the initial spell focus spell, or with the initial elemental focus spell, and your advanced bloodline spell with an advanced elemental focus spell that is shown down here. If you're playing a druid, and if you're of the storm order, you can choose to replace your starting order spell, Tempest Surge, with the updraft elemental focus spell. And if you're a wizard, rather than selecting one of the normal arcane schools, you instead specialize in a school of magic based on one of the 4 elements: air, earth, fire, or water. And like when you select any of your other schools, when you select your element, you can only use spells in that element slot for your bonus spell slots and for your additional cantrips. On top of that, your normal school spells are replaced with the elemental focus spells, as I motioned down here before. So this is all just at level 1, might I add. There's actually a lot more to this archetype than just this, and it's a really good one. But let's look at the actual dedication feat itself. So for the dedication feat, during your daily preparation, you can attune yourself to one element of your choice. That means even if you are a wizard who has to select a elemental focus, you can still select a different focus depending on what your needs are, because when you do choose your focus, you gain resistance equal to half your level against damage dealt by effects with your attuned elemental traits. And the attunement obviously lasts until your next daily preparations. So this is a really decent one. It's not a very exciting archetype dedication feat itself, but that's because you get a lot when you select this at level 1, and it alters everything at level 1. So it's a little bit forgivable, but honestly, since it's a feat you have to select, it kind of sucks. But obviously having elemental attunement and being able to get damage resistance equal to half your level, rounding up obviously, is really good. So it's okay for a dedication feat, but it works really well with the Elementalist. Dowsing Spell is the first meta magic feat that we pick up along the way, and a lot of the Elementalist feats are meta magic, so they alter your spells. And what Dowsing Spell does is it gives the water trait to the spell that you're about to cast, and you essentially douse the target. It makes the spell gain the water trait. So if an enemy has a weakness to water, this will trigger its weakness. And if it's a buffing spell onto an ally who is currently suffering from persistent acid or fire damage, you actually reduce the DC to get rid of those effects down to 10 rather than 15, which is huge. And not only that, the creature can attempt the flat check immediately when you cast the spell on them. So this is a really good archetype feat in general. It allows you to, situationally anyway, help your allies who are suffering from some persistent damages, or to add water to one of your spells. Now, if you're using the bonus archetype feat or bonus rule, which I recommend everyone does, I do recommend selecting these kind of feats because they make your spellcasting incredibly flexible on what you're doing. This allows you to, even if you have a more elemental focus in a different direction, like fire, for instance, you can still technically have a fire dowsing spell, which is very interesting. There's no conflict that's written here in the rules, at the very least, even though it doesn't make the most sense. Regardless, I think it's really, really cool. And I'm all about feats and metamagics that change up how spells actually function. I just think it's really, really good. Next up is Elemental Familiar. And Elemental Familiar is a pretty interesting one. If you have a familiar anyway, it changes that familiar to be composed of the element of your choice. And not only that, but it gains that element's trait as well. Not only that, you do gain one additional familiar ability each day that must be used to select one of the elemental traits, and you can only have one of these elemental traits on at a time. Now, the extra feat is good, but also it's not as cool as it might be. This is really good if you love familiars, but this extra bonus cannot apply to like the specific familiars unless you have at least an additional ability over. So for instance, if the specific familiar required 4, which I think Spell Slime does, and you have 5 familiar abilities, then you can use this and you can have a elemental Spell Slime. Really cool. But if you only had 4 abilities, you can't actually select the elemental slime because this bonus one can only be used to select one of these features. So just something to keep in mind. This is really interesting, but again, if you have to be into familiars to really get the most out of this one. I like it personally because I think familiars are incredibly handy, and there's many ways they can be very ingeniously used. But if you're not into familiars, of course, this one is not going to be probably for you. Also, at level 4 in this archetype, you can pick up the familiar feat. So you can have a familiar. So you can select an elemental familiar a little bit later if you really want to. Very interesting. You could go very familiar focus with Elementalist, which I find interesting. I don't know how effective that is, but it's definitely an aesthetic, that's for sure. And, well, you get familiar. That's really cool. Next up is Enhanced Familiar, so you can give your familiar more familiar abilities. And this works just like how it does normally. You get 4 abilities rather than 2. And if you are the Improved Familiar Attunement Wizard or the Witch, obviously this just increases your base that your improvements increase off of. So this just gives your familiar more abilities. And on top of that, this is really good if you do want a specific elemental familiar. As like I said, you could take this one with the elemental one to get the elemental spell slime pretty much at level 6. Pretty good. Again, this is if you want a familiar. It's a very familiar focused direction you can take, but I think it's still pretty cool. All right, next up is Burning Spell. This is actually a really good spell. If your next action is to cast a spell that is a non-cantrip spell that consumes a spell slot, you actually deal persistent burning damage and your spell gains the fire trait. Now, it does have to be a spell that is a single target. I don't think it has to be an attack spell. It does not. So it just has to be a spell that deals damage to a single target, which is really good, gains the fire trait, and does persistent fire damage equal to the spell's level. This is a really good way to add very consistent damage to your spells. And because it doesn't need to be an attack spell specifically, as long as the enemy even just succeeds the spell and takes damage against a spell save, this effect will still go off. Now, obviously, this doesn't stack if the spell already does persistent fire damage, but there's actually not a lot of slotted spells that do persistent fire damage. So this is going to be very useful a lot. And similar to Dowsing Spell, I really highly recommend taking this one because it gives you that extra dynamicism. And not only that, but this just increases your spell's damage overall, which is just really good. Next up is Current Spell, which is another really good meta magic, though it's a little bit more limited. So essentially, if you're going to cast a spell that consumes a spell slot and is not a cantrip, that either has the water or air trait, you get the benefit of either a +1 bonus to your AC or a +2 bonus to your AC against range attacks. And not only that, based on the elements of the spell, or potentially both, depending on the spell, you also get a bonus to your saves of a +1 circumstance to your saves. So this is a really decent one if you're in a more defensive casting position. The hard part is using it easily with water and air spells, even though there are a fair amount of them. Just something to keep in mind based on how your spell list is composed and what spells you're using. Though my only argument against this one is, why use Current Spell when you can use the shield cantrip instead and even have the shield block ability? Now, obviously, this comes in handy if you had to use your shield block to block some damage from yourself earlier before, but the +1 to AC is not as big of a deal. I think it really sticks with the +2, and if you're a backline caster, you're going to be targeted by range attacks anyway. So getting that +2 to your AC against range attacks is pretty big. This is a really good one. It's a little bit more limited, so this one I'm not going to highly recommend as much as Blazing Spell or Doused. But if you have the type of spells that Current Spell would use, I do highly recommend taking this one in your build. Metabolize Element. Someone's been watching a little bit of Fairy Tail. This is a very interesting reaction. So it's a reaction you take, and it's triggered by you taking damage from a foe's spell or magical ability that has the air, earth, fire, or water traits. Very interesting, very niche, because it does need to be like a magical ability or a spell ability. But you can get essentially quickened on your next turn to step or stride, which is potentially really good, can get you out of some bad situations. And since a lot of these spells do use meta magics that have a single action, this is actually the perfect way to reposition while still using a meta magic enhanced spell. So I actually do really like this one, and most spellcasters do not have reactions, so this is a good way to get a little bit of extra action economy when it's not your turn. It is very situational, but depending on some games, as long as it's a magic-like ability, it can work. So this is a very solid one overall, and I do like its ability to kind of get you out of trouble if necessary. Next up is a Monk Feat. Yes, Monk Feat. Not Monk's Feet, a Monk Feat. You know what I mean. No weird pictures, please. So Water Step. It allows you to spend movement to walk across water. This only lasts for your movement. So if you ever end your movement on a water surface that can't support your weight, you drop in. Pretty simple. It's just one of those things that it's a very interesting one. I do like it, though I don't know many situations where this one might come up, but it is at least a more common, though still niche situation. So I do like this one. And it does have some good opportunities as well, and some good roleplay ability outside of combat. So this is a good one for outside of combat stuff because it lets you move across water sources if necessary. So I do like this one, just not high on my list. Next up is Rock Slide Spell. This is a really good meta magic, actually. It's surprisingly really strong. So what it does is if your next action is to cast a spell that's not a cantrip and consumes a spell slot, you can create a bunch of 5-foot squares that must be contiguous of difficult terrain equal to the spell's level. This is actually a really good spell to trap or at least make it harder for an enemy to move. If you're creating a hallway, or if you're in a hallway, for instance, is a good way to make that hallway essentially double its length as far as like distance they need to travel. And this works in a lot of situations. You can slap this onto a fireball and you can create 3 difficult terrain squares like around the enemy, forcing them to expend extra movement when you're initiating with a fireball. Now, it does only last for a minute, but it does give this spell the Earth trait as well. Not a minute, sorry. Lasts for a round. And it does give your spell the Earth trait. So if an enemy has an Earth weakness, which I don't think there is any enemies that have an Earth weakness, maybe an elemental enemy, I'm not 100% sure. Regardless, still potentially really good, and still really good in a lot of other situations in conjunction with other game effects. And the difficult terrain is surprisingly really handy, as honestly, difficult terrain is only useful for one round typically anyway, because the enemy has either circumvented it or had to move through it. So I do really like this one a lot. Redirect Element is a really good reaction and probably my favorite from the archetype. So what it does is if a spell attack roll from a foe misses or critically misses you, as a reaction, you can redirect it to any other target within the spell's range, and the enemy needs to re-roll the attack roll. This is a really good counter magic spell. Now, obviously, it has to be a spell attack roll, and most spells in the game are actually based on saves, especially when it comes to spells. Things like lightning bolt, and the like. So, obviously, this one is going to be a little bit more niche, but it has some potentially really helpful elements to it. And if you're not taking metabolized elements that we mentioned before, this is a really good one to take because it's a good reaction if it ever comes up, especially since you're probably playing a spellcaster who doesn't get the ability to have reactions most of the time anyway. So regardless, I think it's a really decent one, and it's able to redirect damage, which is a pretty big power move when it comes to combat. The last feat and the last meta magic here on the list is the Wind Toss spell. But before we get into that, I'm gonna get you guys again. That's right, it's time for the plug. You know the drill. If you're enjoying this video, at least leave a like. If you want to see more like it, subscribe. And obviously we have a Discord linked down in the description where we talk all things tabletop, including games, war games like Warhammer 40k. So if you want to join our great community, I highly recommend doing so. Anyway, on with the feat. Wind Toss spell is actually a really good meta magic, especially because it's one of the few that can be used on a cantrip. If your next action is to cast a spell that requires a spell attack roll, you ignore the target's concealed and cover. More or less, that's it. The spell also gains the air trait, so if the enemy has a weakness to air, there you go. So overall, it's a really good one. There's a lot of situations where an ally or another enemy might be in between you and your foe, so this does remove the light cover that they might have from your spell attack. And because it can be used with cantrips, this is a really good one if you don't mind just rooting in place and increasing your probability of striking an enemy. It's not very fancy, but I feel this is probably one of the meta magics that can come up the most of any of the other meta magics that you can pick up from Elementalist. So this is one I would highly recommend if you're selecting, bonus archetype feats, even if you're adding it to your class. I mean, this is just a really good ability. And I do like the aesthetic of this spell allows you to force the direction using wind currents to make your spell like curve around cover and stuff like that. It's really good, honestly. And that's going to be Elementalist. I hope y'all enjoyed. I do like the Elementalist, and I do like a lot of the class style archetype dedications. I wish there was more martial ones. Most of the ones in the game currently are for magic casters because most of them came out in the Secrets of Magic book. But hopefully martials will get their own varieties at a later point. Fingers crossed. Regardless, I think the Elementalist is a really good one, and it can completely change your build, and it completely changes your spell list. So this is a good way if you are tired of playing a particular class in the way that you've been playing it before. This is a good way to mix it up without necessarily having to pick a different class if you're that one person who always selects Sorcerer or Wizard or something along those lines. But that's going to be it for me. So thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.